I'll introduce you in English, Alan, because I'm reading, you know. And I can barely see it without, I have to take my glasses off anyway, but there we go. Felly mae Alan yn athro, he's a professor of sport and social theory at Loughborough University, having previously worked at Ulster University. He's a graduate in politics from the University of Edinburgh and took his PhD in political thought at the University of Hull. He serves on the editorial boards of the International Review for the Sociology of Sport, National Identities, and Soccer and Society. His recent publications include Sport and Secessionism in 2021, then Sport in Taiwan, History, Culture, Policy, 2023, co-edited there. From Old Tom Morris to Andy Murray, an examination of the Scottishness of Scotland's sporting celebrities. Then, Indigenous, Traditional and Folk Sport, Contesting Modernities in 2024, published by Routledge. And then Football Diaspora and Turkish Cypriot Identity in London, Sport in Society. We're very pleased to have you with us. Croeso mawr I ti, Alan, ac yn edrych ymlaen, very much looking forward to your talk. Croeso, Alan.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I feel a little bit of an imposter for two reasons. First, I know very little about languages. And second, I claimed that I was going to give an overview. And having even heard the presentations this morning, I mean, an overview of this particular topic would take considerably longer than I have. So what I'm going to do, and it's something I've been doing a lot recently, is reminisce. One of the great virtues of old age, if I could call it a virtue, is that we can actually use our own memory bank as a data source. As long as that memory lasts, it sometimes has to be recharged again. But I thought I'd just talked a little bit about my own life in relation to football and identity. So starting with being born in 1951 in Fife in Scotland. I was born in Kirkcaldy but grew up in Dunfermline. My earliest memories, I suppose, include the fact that I knew that my father had fought in the Second World War in the Royal Navy, specifically in the submarine service, and that most of his crewmates were from other parts of the United Kingdom and even from what's now the Commonwealth. There were very few Scots that he served with at all. So he had a keen sense of Britishness at that time, as I think most people in Scotland had. The Scottish National Party, in its fledgling forms, was seen as something of an oddity in Scottish political life. I also have vague memories, but I think they're memories, but I may have been told about them, that it happened, of the Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. Although as I was thinking about this, I felt I should really call her Queen Elizabeth I, because of course, as our song goes, how can she be a Lizzie Twa when the first yin hasn't been? Growing up then in Dunfermline, and most of you, I think all of you, probably all of you are too young to know that Dunfermline Athletic had glory days. From about 1961 to 1968, which of course for me was a formative period, most of it spent in secondary school. And inspired by a manager whose name you will perhaps know, Jock Stein, who briefly was a professional footballer here in South Wales, played for Llanelli Town. Went on, of course, to be the first British manager to lift the European Cup in 1967, and then died in Cardiff at the end of a Wales-Scotland game, at the very end of the game, televised. It was obvious there was something wrong with him, and he died that day in his early 60s. supporting Dunfermline opened my eyes to the Celtic-Rangers rivalry. I thought that the biggest game that really affected Scottish football fans for many years was the Scotland-England game in the old Home Nations competition. It was just massive in Scotland. All the sports papers, the Saturday papers, had special issues in the morning of the match, whether it was in London or in Glasgow. People saved up in their pubs and so on to make sure that they had enough money to make the trip to Wembley every 2 years. And of course, losing to England was seen as some kind of national disaster. It was only after I went to study at the University of Hull that I realized the English didn't care nearly as much as we did. Indeed, the first England-Scotland game I saw on TV when I was in Hull, Scotland lost 5-1 at Wembley. And I didn't really know whether to go out to the pub at the end of the game and be mocked by all these people or just stay at home. And my need for a pint was such that I went off to the pub. And the first person who came in after I'd arrived asked me what I'd been doing this afternoon. And I said, I watched the England-Scotland game. Oh, how did that go, he said. I said, well, Scotland lost 5-1. Oh, did they? He said, I've been in the garden. And he said, it was a lovely day. I thought, nobody in Scotland would have been in the garden on that particular day. Indeed, it would be very unlikely that it would be nice weather either. So Scotland was the big thing. It made us feel Scottish. It was probably, along with visits to Edinburgh, for example, where you had a sense that you were British, but there was something else to your identity. But my eyes were open to the old firm, and the most memorable moment was when Dunfermline played Rangers at home the day after President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated. And, generally, I think people felt that he was a great man. He wasn't without his flaws, as we know now, but by goodness, compared to the present incumbent, he was a giant amongst men and almost a saint. But the Rangers supporters, we had a minute's silence, and the Rangers supporters jeered and sang all the way through it. And I said to my dad, what's going on? Did they not hear the announcement? He said, oh, they heard the announcement. He said, but he was an Irish Catholic. I thought, wow. And this was strange for me. I sort of knew, I think I'd heard that he was of Irish heritage and things, but I still didn't think that people would behave like that at that time. I think nowadays you would expect it more, perhaps, and in a way, applause has replaced the minute silence very often, depending on who has died. But that was an eye-opener, and of course, the rivalry has persisted to the present day. As regards language, just briefly, I knew, of course, that the Gaelic language was spoken in Scotland, and I understood from quite an early age that it had a certain symbolic significance, because it did mean that we had our own language, except in West Fife we didn't have it. And I was probably in my 20s before I actually met a Gaelic speaker. What I didn't think about at the time was that, in fact, we did have our own language, and it was Scots, now recognised, of course, by the Scottish government. I'm not saying that many of us, or indeed any of us, spoke Scots the whole time, but we knew the vocabulary. We knew there was a literary tradition. But of course, depending upon the type of school you went to, many of the teachers made it their business to get rid of any Scotticisms. The great philosopher David Hume apparently asked God to forgive him for his Scotticisms. It was curious that he asked God after much of what he'd said in his philosophical work, but nevertheless he was He was ashamed of being Scottish in that sense. Now, I don't want to get into a debate as to whether what we were speaking was a language or simply a dialect, but I think it's worth quoting the lyrics of a song by the Proclaimers, the great singing duo, saying, "I'm just going to have to learn to hesitate, to make sure my words on your Saxon ears don't grate, but I wouldn't know a single word to say if I flattened all the vowels and I threw the R away." So that's what teachers were telling us to do, essentially, flatten our vowels and throw the R away. Having gone through the process in England and got used to the fact that they didn't really see us as serious rivals at all, I ended up in 1978 in Northern Ireland, teaching at what was then the Ulster Polytechnic, is now Ulster University. And I watched a lot of football in the first year that I was there. I mean, regularly watched all of the Belfast clubs and some further afield in the north. And I attended the 1979 Irish Cup final, which featured Cliftonville playing against Portadown. Now, Cliftonville are a peculiar club because they'd been amateur for many, many years and were seen almost as a club that middle-class professionals would play for. And they played in a fairly genteel part of North Belfast. But by the time I arrived, much of the large houses in that area had been converted into apartments. There'd been population shifts due to the violence. And it had become a much more nationalist area and, I would say, more working class. Now, Catholics in Belfast hadn't really had a team to support for many years because of the demise of Belfast Celtic. And a lot of young guys, in particular guys, turned their attention to Cliftonville if they came from North Belfast. And then they were joined by people from West Belfast as well, and in this thing which they then thought of as the Red Army. So playing Portadown in a final, of course, Portadown became notorious really as a place of trouble associated with Orange Order parades in predominantly Republican or nationalist areas. But what was strange about that game was that when you looked out from where the Cliftonville supporters were, and I was with them, all you could see were the colours of other Northern Irish clubs. Not just Portadown colours, but Linfield scarves, Glentoran scarves, Crusaders scarves. It was like the Protestant football community of Northern Ireland had come out to see that these rebellious Fenians were going to be crushed. And of course, Cliftonville won that cup final, their first victory for many, many years. I think the most interesting time I had in Northern Ireland, though, was when I was invited to go and give some talks in the Maze Prison, or Long Kesh as it was known by its inmates. The idea was that whilst many of the prisoners, particularly Republican prisoners, were making the most of prison education, partly to improve themselves, but also as they said to me, just to occupy the prison service and to make demands on the British government. So you had people, I mean, the man who almost killed Margaret Thatcher did his PhD in Long Kesh. So they were making the most of it. But there was a feeling that loyalist prisoners weren't doing so much of that, and there were younger and younger Republicans who didn't really see the point of formal education either. And so I was supposed to go along and talk to them about sport and see if that would encourage them to think more widely about society and things. So we talked about gender and race and so on. The only sport they were allowed to play themselves was football. And of course, the Republicans, some of the Republicans at least, argued that it would be good if they could play Gaelic football. But then it wasn't really very probable that they could do that, because at least with football you could say keep the ball on the ground the whole time. because above their heads, of course, there were all these mechanisms to try and prevent helicopters from dropping anybody in to help a rescue or an escape. And so Gaelic football would have been a disaster. The ball would have been getting stuck in these things all the time and so on. So they didn't really care, I don't think. It was a tactic again. They were happy to play their games of football. But they had big arguments about football. One Republican said to another one, I don't know why you're in here. You watch Coronation Street, you read the Mirror, and you support Nottingham Forest. He said, you should be in there with the loyalists. I mean, pretty cruel to one of his comrades in arms. But the most interesting discussion they had was about the relationship between the Republic of Ireland football team and Northern Ireland. And almost every one of them said, although we were born in Belfast or Derry or Lurgan or wherever, we support the Irish Republic and not the Northern Ireland team. Until one prisoner turned round and said, I don't support either of them. I said, do you not like football? And he said, yeah, I do like football. But he says, but they're both the product of partition. He said, until we have a united Ireland team, I won't be able to support either, or support it. And one of his mates just mumbled, we'll have a united Ireland before we have a single Irish football team, which clearly was a reference on his part, particularly to the Irish Football Association. Because already there were campaigns starting that the Irish Football Association should do away with, as it was, God Save the Queen as the anthem, because this was made many players from nationalist backgrounds uncomfortable if they found themselves, even in the underage squads of the Northern Ireland setup. I was part of an advisory committee to the devolved government to talk about reforms that could be made to Northern Irish football. And one of them, and I wasn't alone, I mean other people even from unionist background who were on the same advisory group, said the same, that God Save the Queen probably had to go. Because what was happening, of course, was that many young nationalists were refusing to play for Northern Ireland and were turning their allegiance, which they were able to do, to represent the Republic. So I went to the then Vice President of FIFA, Jimmy Boyce, who was himself a Cliftonville man, but not an old-style Cliftonville man, not part of the Red Army generation, let's put it that way. And I said, you know, I really do think it's probably time to change this anthem. And he said, I won't be the man to do that. I won't be the man to get rid of our national anthem. And I thought, well, you know. But luckily, there was a man from the Northern Ireland Supporters Club from the Shankill Road who was also there, and he said, well, I think you should get rid of it. You're harming our team's chances of doing anything in international football. Still got God Save the King. Well, God Save the King now to the present day. I mean, even rugby, of course, has tried to change things around, but partly because they have players from both sides of the border in their national team. Back, though, to the prison and language. And, of course, we know that the debates about the use of Ulster Scots and the debates of the Irish language were partly responsible for the breakdown of the whole devolved government for a while. And many unionists that I know are still, I mean, a bit amused by the whole Ulster Scots thing, which makes me think, am I still thinking it's not really much of a language either? But one of the wings in the H blocks in Long Kesh was for Irish language use only. And I mean, it was only one leg of an H, so there weren't many prisoners in it. I found myself in it one day by mistake. The prison officer had sent me down the wrong thing. So through about 5 different gates, and then I suddenly saw that all the signs were in Irish. And I thought, how do I get out of here? I mean, I have to be able to speak Irish to ask if I can leave. And luckily, somebody took pity on me and said, are you lost? Which was an interesting thought in a prison, that somebody could get lost there. And I said, yeah, I think I'm in the wrong place. So I came out of... Now, this was the wing that they themselves called the jail-tacht, as opposed, of course, to the Gael-tacht, which they found incredibly amusing. And we had lots of different people went in to speak to the prisoners, and so doing similar things to me just to try and get them interested. The most popular man was the one who taught them how to make fish flies for fishing. And he said, it's amazing how talented some of them are very nimble with their fingers. And then, of course, he said, of course, they're the bomb makers. Which was but they got an author whose work had all been in the Irish language from the northwest of Ireland. And she was in one day, and we both wished each other well as we set off to our different age blocks. And she was sent to the jail-tacht. And she came back and she said, I said, well, how was it? She said, it was very nice. She said, I have no idea what they were saying. But they had evolved their own version of the Irish language. And of course, in many ways, these are the people who have inspired the development of the Irish language more commonly in Northern Ireland now, with a number of Irish medium classes in the north, which I think makes a difference. I think Ellen's giving me signs that my time is up. Not my time quite. I've still got... Old I may be, but my time's not yet up. But I'll just finish, because I think what a lot of this illustrates is how football can be a great source of goodwill and bringing people together and so on, but it's also potentially incredibly divisive. It's interesting that Glentoran Football Club in East Belfast, who play in the shadow of the old shipyard Hound and Wolf, have not a motto in English, which I think, or even also Scots for that matter, but in French, le jeu avant tout, the game before everything. And it's a noble sentiment, but I think for so many people, there are other important things that football is implicated with very often, but perhaps surpass football in terms of their importance in their everyday lives. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.